Welcome back to our ongoing series on the book of Revelation, chapters 16 through 18, entitled The Seven Bowls of Wrath, Armageddon, and the Vision of the Fall of the Dragon's Allies. Today, we will continue with part 4 of 5 weeks on chapter 16, the Bowls of Wrath of God. And today we will look only at one single verse, verse 16, and we're going to cover the subject of Armageddon. In addition, we're going to read Revelation 19, 11 through 21 for context. Yes, I'm breaking my rules about going out of order. Anyway, stick with me. Before we dive into the scripture, I would like you to take a moment, please, and write down on page 19 of your handout or whatever paper you have what you know about or understand about Armageddon. Where have you heard it referred to? What do you think it's about? What does it mean to you at this moment? Another way maybe to help you would be to write down movies that you've seen which use this term, or try to portray what this term means to you. How does the movie you cited depict how you envision Armageddon? So yes, I do hope to change your mind a bit within this presentation, but you will appreciate that you took the time to do this now by pausing the video here for a few moments, and when you're finished writing down your thoughts, you can restart. As an introduction, Steve Sewell offers a great recap for this chapter and a projection for where we're going in the following quote. This sixth bowl judgment is what is known as the War of Armageddon, which is the final confrontation between the people of Christ, the church, and the people of the world, between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness. This war begins with a coordinated global assault against Christians with the purpose of annihilating them. Christians will be killed on a large global scale. However, God will breathe life back to them via the resurrection. But it will leave the world with nothing but unbelievers. At that point, God unleashes his judgment upon the world via the plagues of this chapter, where this war of Armageddon will end with the return of Christ. We see this in the seventh bowl judgment, although not specifically mentioned in that particular scene. Also, so that we're clear on this, the judgment upon the world as revealed in this chapter is the same judgment upon Babylon the great harlot of chapter 17 and 18. Babylon symbolizes primarily the world system, but it also has a physical world in view as depicted in chapter 18. So that's a look forward as well as a little bit of a look backward. So as is our custom, I'm going to ask you to please read aloud Revelation 16:16. In order to give it a little bit more background, we're going to go ahead and read Revelation 19:11 through 21. You can do that in your own Bibles, or of course, I have them on this and the next 4 or 5 slides. I'll give you a moment, and 5 seconds on each slide. All right, let's dig in here. Items to investigate a little further. On our first reading, let's clarify 2 things. Revelation 16, verse 16, is when the armies gather. Revelation 19, is the final battle against the rider on the white horse. We will debunk all that is Armageddon and explore background of this place, its other names, and its history in and outside the Bible. But we're not going to investigate the full meaning of chapter 19 excerpt as yet. So here are the items I will chat about in this video, and should you have additional questions, of course, please bring them to group discussion time. The sixth bowl in the great river Euphrates dried up to make way for war. It's kind of we're going to have a continuation of this. Where is Armageddon? Is Armageddon the same as Armageddon? What are the other biblical references to Armageddon? Are there other references to either of those names in history? What does Armageddon symbolize? And where are the battles of this war described? Well, the first thing we see is that they're gathered to battle. This battle is not nation against nation, but the nations against God. We can see this prophesied or explained in Psalm 2, verses 1 through 3. Why did the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. Psalm 2 is an important psalm for the Jewish people. It sets before them the conflict that has been raging since Babel, an ancient conflict of united peoples against God. This is one of the three important battles mentioned in prophecy. From Ezekiel 38:39, the battle of Gog, Magog, and her allies come against Israel. The battle of Armageddon, when the Antichrist leads the world system against the returning Jesus, is in Revelation 17:12 through 16 and 19:17 through 21. And the final battle, when Satan and his allies, after the millennium, make war against God in chapter 20 of Revelation, verses 7 through 10. Note that the Battle of Armageddon does not happen here. It just says they are gathered for battle. The final battle is in Revelation 19:11 through 21. And the other battles are not described anywhere in the Bible. It's the gathering and the final battle. That's it. The place called Armageddon, where is it? Well, the proper Greek terminology is the Greek word that's saying there. So in English, we translate it into a corruption of the Greek word, and we say in English, Armageddon. But the compound Hebrew word is Har, meaning mountain, and Meggidon, or Megiddo, which is a name of a plain or a city located in the Manasseh section near Galilee. The total compound Hebrew word Har-Megiddo means the mountains of Megiddo, which does not exist. The word Armageddon is spelled differently in several Greek manuscripts. This name appears nowhere else in Greek or Hebrew literature. There have been several theories to understand this name, and some identify actual places. It refers to some to the mountains of Megiddo, a northern city in the tribal location of Manasseh that was built on a hill, but in no way was it a mountain. It refers sometimes to the city of Megiddo, but the problem is that this is not the exact spelling of that city. It's a translation of the phrase, the Mount of Assembly, found in Isaiah 14:13, which refers to the ultimate mountain of God which Satan attacks. It also refers to the whole promised land. It refers to the fruitful mountain, which would symbolize Jerusalem, the end-time site of many of the final battles between good and evil. And you can find that in the prophecy of Joel. Joel, in chapter 3, mentions the valley of Jehoshaphat, and the meaning in Hebrew for Jehoshaphat is the judgment of God, as the scene of God's final vengeance on God's opposing foe. Megiddo comes from a root word, gadad, meaning to cut off or slaughter, making this reference to the destroying mountain of Jeremiah 51:25 as a symbol of Rome's destruction. So, since there's no specific mountain, Megiddo is actually a valley, not a mountain, as many see this as a symbolic mountain or a hill of slaughter. There are lots of names for the same place. It's a valley, or more correctly, the plain of Megiddo is known as JEZREEL in the Old Testament and Esdraelon in New Testament times. Esdraelon is the Greek modification of JEZREEL. And JEZREEL is also known as Campus Legionis, in Roman. And then there's lots of other names there. The Bible speaks of gathering of armies in the place of Armageddon. So when you come across these titles in the Bible, they're all talking about one place in Israel. I'll try to keep to using the Jezreel Valley or Jezreel for the location in Palestine when talking about Old Testament scripture, which primarily uses that description. I will use Armageddon or Armageddon for the battle that is referred to in the book of Revelation. This is a slide which shows some of the geographical information for the Jezreel Valley. Here are maps showing the location of Megiddo, which is the Jezreel Valley, and Jerusalem. And the meaning of Jezreel in Hebrew means God sows, and it's mentioned 30 times in the Bible. So Jezreel is a very popular place, and lots of things happened in biblical history and real life and documented history outside the Bible in the Jezreel Valley. It's been called the heart of the Promised Land. And it's a 141 square mile triangle or arrow-shaped land parcel in the north central area of Israel. And today it's a beautiful plain of fertile fields and winding roads, and it's hemmed in by rolling mountains that offer stunning scenic views. You have to look at the photographs I have on some of the slides. The rich alluvial soil of the Jezreel Valley is as much as 330 feet deep in places. It's amazing soil, and the abundance of water ensures excellent crops, even in years of limited rainfall. The agricultural possibilities here are so extraordinary, and it's compared to the rest of Palestine that Herod the Great actually claimed the valley as his own royal estate at one point. Today, Jezreel is drained and fertile fields abound. And because of its superior farmland and strategic highways, the Jezreel Valley has always been one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in Palestine, as it is Israel's breadbasket. The Megiddo Mound has a copious spring emanating from a small cave near its base and provided water for those who settled there. One of the most interesting structures to explore at Megiddo is the large water system built during the reigns of the northern kings of Omri and Ahab in 780 to 753 BC. In order to gain protected access to the spring, which was at that point outside the city walls, they dug this big shaft with steps along it that led to the city's water source, and it concealed and blocked the approach to the cave. And it was a very critical asset for any of the many conquerors who took control of this area and for those who took shelter against the invader. Overflowing with material blessings, this valley was Israel's testing ground of faith. Perhaps for this reason, it figures so prominently in John's apocalypse in Revelation. Surely the faith of humanity is being tested here in Revelation with all the trials and tribulations in that book. All right, location. The city was located in red in the diagram there about 26 kilometers or 15 miles east of the Mediterranean Ocean, and about 40 kilometers southwest of the Sea of Galilee. The spacious JEZREEL Valley spreads out to the north and east from Mount Carmel, providing convenient passage for international travelers in ancient times. The international highway traversed this pass and carried traders and armies from Asia, Europe, and Africa. Megiddo's strategic importance lay in one's ability to use its nearby hill to monitor such traffic. Strategically located in Galilee at the intersection of the ancient international highway between Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Via Maris, and the route south to Samaria and Jerusalem, the Way of the Patriarchs. And it was also at the intersection of these two main roads, which was located at a critical pass, Wadi Ara, through the Carmel mountain range. Megiddo was a fascinating site of at least 20 cities built directly on top of one another and inhabited continuously from 3000 BC to 300 BC. Whoever had control of Megiddo had control over the major trade routes of antiquity. This strategic placed road, this location was also a military compound, and it was sometime a residence for Israelite kings, and it was in the middle, as we've already said, of agricultural Eden. The mound of Megiddo has been excavated, and the modern name of the site is Tel El Mutsalim. Excavations have unearthed 26 different layers of ruin, indicating a long period of settlement, and the city gate and wall have been identified as well. This plain is so astonishing that Napoleon Bonaparte, when he first viewed it, was reported to have said, quote, "All the armies of the world could maneuver their forces on this vast plain. There's no place in the whole world more suited for war than this. It's the most natural battleground of the whole earth," unquote. Now, the downside of a strategic location. In Al-Haroni's book on historical geography, he lists 4 criteria for occupation: strategic location, access to roads, access to water, and agricultural land. Megiddo's location met all 4 with big stars. Very few sites around the world can do so. The downside for being such an attractive site was that the probability of war, as nations sought to control this place for their own ends, to control the tax and international traffic, or secure lines of communications to and from far-flung lands. Megiddo was easily accessible to traders and migrants from all directions, but at the same time, it could, if powerful enough, control access to means of these routes and so direct both the course of trade and war. It is not surprising, therefore, that at most periods of antiquity, this was always one of the most wealthiest cities. In his review of Megiddo and surrounds, Klein counted no fewer than 34 all-out wars located there from 2350 BC to 2000 AD. And he says nearly every invading force of Israel, everyone that came into that Palestine area, has fought a battle in the JEZREEL Valley. Virtually every invading army came through this region during the past 4,000 years and fought battles for control of Megiddo and the JEZREEL Valley within a larger war context. The only exception was the army of Alexander the Great, who didn't have to fight because the area just surrendered to him first. There were so many battles in this little valley, which measures 20 miles long by 7 miles wide, that one might edit Sir Winston Churchill's comment in World War II and say, "Never in the field of human conflict have so many fought over so little space." Realize I'm taking liberty there. Over 200 battles have been fought in the region from 2325 to 2275 BCE, clear through 1917 with Lord Allenby of the British. So I gave you this, I believe, in your handout, but it's worth citing all the different uh, nations that have been here: Egyptians, Canaanites, Israelites, Midianites, Amalekites, Philistines, Hasmoneans, Greeks, Romans, Muslims, Crusaders, Mamluks, Mongols, French, Ottomans, British, Australians, Germans, Arabs, and Israelis have all fought and died there. The names of warring generals and leaders reverberate throughout history: Tutmos III, Deborah and Barak, Sisera, Gideon, Saul, David and Jonathan, Shishak, Jehu, Joram, Jezebel, Josiah, Antiochus, Ptolemy, Vespasian, Saladin, Napoleon, and Allenby, just to name a few of the most famous people that battled in that area. Throughout history, Megiddo and the JEZREEL Valley have been ground zero for battles that have determined the very course of civilization. It is no wonder that the author of Revelation believed Armageddon, the penultimate battle between good and evil, would also take place in this region. When I first started accumulating the information from a historical perspective, I did not realize how much information was out there. Realizing that there are history buffs listening, I did take the time to compile a short list for you in your handout and here on the next 4 slides. Please note, this is not a complete list. It's the information I ran into rather than doing a proper detailed research on the historical happenings of the Valley of Megiddo. I will not present this material to save time. If you have other questions, I do have additional information I'd be glad to share in our group sessions. So peruse the list and maybe record some thoughts as to what is listed. I will pause on each slide for about 5 seconds, so you can pause and restart as you wish. Today, visitors would see acres of ruins, a fascinating water system, and complex gate systems, and it would be hard to believe the exact location of Megiddo was actually lost in history at one time. From about 330 BC on, this was forgotten as the site of the city of Megiddo. But by the 4th century, Jerome only had a vague idea. When Edward Robertson visited the Tel el Mutsanim in 1852, he said the Tel has no trace of any kind to show that a city ever stood there. And it was not until it was excavated in the early 20th century that the location was discovered. This slide shows overhead pictures of the excavated Tel Mound and the area that can be seen today. Let's turn to a little bit more of a biblical understanding of the Valley of JEZREEL and Megiddo. In other words, why is this area so important to the Jewish people? William Hendrickson, from his book, More Than Conquerors, offers a great summary. Of late, it's been raining sermons and lectures on Armageddon. But in order to arrive at the correct interpretation of this battle, let's begin by briefly reviewing the Old Testament stories in which the symbol is probably rooted. Hendrickson is saying that the stories in the Old Testament will provide a greater understanding here for John's use of the Valley of Megiddo in his book of Revelation. Although Megiddo has been extensively chronicled in extra biblical sources, it's only mentioned 12 times in the Old Testament and once indirectly in the New Testament as Armageddon. But there are three key stories that shed some understanding for us about Megiddo. One is Israel under Deborah and Barak in the book of Judges, chapters 4 and 5, Gideon's battle with the Midianites and the Amalekites in the book of Judges, chapters 6 and 7, and then the invasions of the Assyrians as told predominantly in Isaiah chapter 8. So let's review some of these stories just in case you don't know them. Israel's Deborah and Barak defeated General Sisera and the Canaanites at the base of Mount Tabor in the eastern end of the valley. Read Judges 4 and 5 for the entire story, which, by the way, is a good one. Continuing with Hendrickson's quote, Israel is in misery again. This time King Jadon the Canaanite is the oppressor. The spoilers go out to ravage the fields and plunder the crops of the Israelites. So numerous are the spoilers that the Israelites go hiding in caves and they're afraid to appear on the highways. But can they not wage war and drive out these Canaanites? No, King Jabin and General Sisera are strong, for they have 900 chariots of iron. Israel has not even a spear or a shield. Well, must the people perish? A battle is fought at Megiddo, and Israel's enemy is routed. It was Jehovah himself who defeated them from heaven. Well, what does this mean? Basically, God sent rain, and he trapped all the Canaanites and General Sisera in the mud. And ultimately, not to be a spoiler alert, it was a woman who slew General Sisera. Let's go on to the next battle between Gideon, the Midianites, and the Amalekites and their allies. This battle, again, was just north of Mount Gilboa, and Gideon was the 5th judge over Israel in the book of Judges. He is introduced in chapter 6, and while he was collecting wheat and hiding it from the enemy. You see, these enemies would come in and just steal all the crops, and if anybody was left around, they would kill them or take them as slaves. So he was collecting wheat and hiding it from the enemy while trying to get the food for his people. The angel came to him and asked him to take on a task of overthrowing the Midianites. Gideon learned to trust God step by step through various tasks God had for Gideon. If the angel had initially told Gideon that he would defeat the 135,000 person army of the Midianites with 300 men with no weapons, Gideon would have had an impossible time believing that the message really was from God. But God did lead him step by step, working with Gideon to develop and trust and get his courage up while protecting him all that time. Then he directed Gideon in paring down the army in such a way that Gideon and his competent and trustworthy men knew that God was in control. The purpose for having such a small army with weapons of torches, jars, and screaming voices was that God wanted Israel to know that it was God and not Gideon and his men who defeated the enemy. And then finally, in 732 BC, the invasion of Syria into northern Israel. So this was what caused the exile of the northern 10 tribes of Israel to Assyria in the 8th century. And this northern invasion route of the Mesopotamian powers into this valley, this JEZREEL valley, became ultimately a cultural symbol for evil for the Israelites. This too was an influence that may have impacted John's understanding of the visions he experienced and the way he communicated his understanding. But possibly more important were the words from Isaiah 8:11 through 15. For the Lord spoke thus to me with a strong hand and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, do not say a conspiracy concerning all these people call a conspiracy, nor be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear, let him be your dread. The Lord will be as a sanctuary, but a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble, and they shall fall and be broken and be snared and taken away. Isaiah and the people of Judah had a good reason to fall into fear. They were weak and vulnerable, and now the Lord tells them an unstoppable Assyrian invasion is possibly only months away. Already the armies of Israel and Syria had destroyed much of Judah. They can't come to their rescue. Now the Lord tells Isaiah the Assyrians, with a much stronger military, would attack them and inflict great damage. In the midst of all this, it would be easy to let one's heart or mind settle on conspiracies and threats, but God tells them not to. Instead of fearing conspiracies and threats, he says, fear God. We should never resign ourselves to be at the mercy of opposing armies, since we're firmly in the grasp of God's hands. We should concern ourselves with our relationship with the Lord instead of our enemies or others that we might fear. The Lord should be our sacred place and our place of protection. He will keep us safe from our enemies, and those who trust in him, the Lord, will be a sanctuary. But for those who don't, he will be a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. Instead of finding protection from the Lord, they will trip over him, falling into destruction, and indeed many among them shall stumble. They shall fall and be broken, and instead of being protected, they will fall and be broken. Let's finish the long quote from William Hendrickson. For this cause, Armageddon is the symbol of every battle in which, when the need is the greatest and the believers are oppressed, the Lord suddenly reveals his power in the interest of his distressed people and defeats the enemy. When Sennacherib's 185,000 are slain by the angel of Jehovah, that is a shadow of the final Armageddon. When God grants a little handful of Maccabees a glorious victory over an enemy that far outnumbers it, that is a type of Armageddon. But the real, the great, the final Armageddon coincides with the time of Satan's little season's end, when God's children, oppressed on every side, cry for help, and then suddenly, dramatically, Christ will appear to deliver his people. That final tribulation and that appearance of Christ on the clouds of glory to deliver his people, that is Armageddon. It is for this reason that Armageddon is the sixth bowl, because the seventh bowl is Judgment Day. Is this a real place or is it symbolic in Revelation? There's quite a panorama of views regarding the literal or symbolic interpretation of the place of the Valley of Megiddo and the prophetic happenings at the Battle of Armageddon. Let's consider a few. Well, it's actually 10 quotes. I apologize. They're on pages 23 through 24 of your handout and on this and the next floor slides. If you could, please read them over before we meet in discussion groups and select the quote you identify with most and maybe one you dislike. Please be prepared to explain why for both. I'm going to pause 5 seconds on each slide so that you can read them here. You can pause and restart as necessary. Well, let's try to summarize some of this up. Verse 16 in chapter 16 doesn't tell us very much that can guide our interpretation here. We need to rely on chapter 19 to help make sense of it. So if we look in chapter 19 and look at verses 11, 14, 17, 19, 20, and 21, we can gather some more factual information. Does any of those verses, does any of this sound like you thought what Armageddon would be? Do any of your favorite movies come close to depicting what's described here? If you're like me, the answer is no. In fact, the biblical story doesn't even depict a battle, let alone a war, right up to the end of the final battle here in chapter 19. We have no information as to what will happen before that. Are there other battles? And what happens in those? And how do we do this? So where do I come all out of this? Well, this is where Mary Jo's mind comes in. This is just my opinion. If we assume that the kings of the earth are actually human beings, and then in order to do battle, they need to be someplace on earth. However, I don't think any of these texts necessarily explain exactly where, or if indeed it's one location. John might understand that many massive global disputes for thousands of years have been solved on the plains of Megiddo, and therefore, why not the battle of all time between good and evil? From John's perspective, and with the support in the pattern of history up until the 1st century, this makes total sense here. I do believe that the history of the Jewish people has shown that in this place is where God rescues his people, where God acts to free his people from the evils of occupation and exile. It's a place where God's people learn to depend on God and give God the glory they might otherwise take for themselves. I find wonderful messages from the stories of the Old Testament of Deborah, Barak, Gideon, and Isaiah. Trust that God will deliver and grant God all the glory. Do not underestimate what God will do for God's people. Isaiah teaches us that we should never resign ourselves to be at the mercy of our enemies because we're already firmly under the protection of God Almighty. We should concern ourselves first with our relationship with the Lord instead of what others we might fear or, frankly, others that we might even love. The Lord should be our sacred place and our place of protection. It's a matter of us trusting in God for a place of sanctuary. All of these lessons have been learned before by people's God in this place of JEZREEL, the supposed location of Armageddon. Today, we're not free from the impact of evil, and we're living in exile from our physical home with God. But with God's Spirit dwelling within us, is the battle just within our hearts and our minds, or is there a larger war coming out there? I do believe there's a coming battle, but whether it's of the minds and the hearts of the people, or as a physical world war battle against the forces of evil in one place, I cannot say. I do know that Jerusalem and the land of Palestine is very important to God because God has acted there on behalf of his people in the past. Also, the New Jerusalem that will make an appearance later in Revelation will be located there. Truthfully, a good case can be made for both interpretations from a biblical and a historical perspective. What I do think is that the verses in Revelation 19 are speaking about is Jesus Christ and his coming to set the people free from evil. It's not really talking about a battle or a war per se. And what all that means, well, we'll chat about that in chapter 19. What do you think? What did you get out of all this? Let's gather to discuss this week this fantastically misunderstood concept of Armageddon. I'll leave you with a message of warning from Ezekiel in chapter 33, verses 1 through 8. But let's pick it up in verse 7. So, you mortal, I have made a sentinel for the house of Israel. Wherever you hear a word from my mouth, you shall give them a warning from me. If I say to the wicked, O wicked ones, you shall surely die, and you don't speak to warn the wicked to turn from their ways, the wicked shall die there in their iniquity, but their blood I will require at your hand. And let's go for a message of hope from Psalm 119, 108 through 112, and then 114. Accept my offerings of praise, O Lord, and teach me your ordinances. I hold my life in my hand continually, but I do not forget your law. The wicked have laid a snare for me, but I do not stray from your precepts. Your decrees are my heritage forever, and they are the joy of my heart. I incline my heart to perform your statutes forever to the end. You are my hiding place and my shield, and I hope in your word. Next week, we're going to do the pouring out of the seventh bowl of God's wrath. May God help us hear not just the trumpets at the end, but his still, small, quiet voice, which calls us to him in his word. May we come to love God's word so that we may direct our hearts and minds. Have a wonderful week. Amen.